A little bit different.
If there was an Olympic event for being a mother, Diane Sorensen, by all external measures, would be the gold medalist, except for things are really not great on the inside. They're not great on her in the inside. They're not great on the inside of their children. They're not great in the inside of her marriage. They're not great in the inside of her home. But on the outside, everything looks perfect. And today, on this episode, she describes one of the most courageous acts a person will ever do: the decision to stop trying to perform to get other people's approval and start trying to be true to yourself and who you really are. I know you're going to love to hear this episode from Diane Sorensen on this episode of Unbeatable. Hey, the wait is over. We've been telling you that something big is coming, and before I even get into this episode, I just want to show you what is coming down the pipe. So here it is. Here is the big future for the Unbeatable Army. Check this out, guys. Hey everyone, today I've got some big news to share. After 3 years of a weekly podcast interviewing some amazing guests, I'm going to make a huge transition. Man, your support to me over the last 3 years has meant the world. But as we move forward, I'm going to replace the Unbeatable podcast, both audio and video, with a television show. You don't have to live in the local area to watch this television show, because the television show is going to broadcast on the internet. It'll be available on Apple TV, on Roku, on Amazon. In fact, I'm launching an entire television channel called Jeff Strucker Ministries. Now, this new venture, it aims to empower lives. We're going to try to inspire people's faith, and I want to continue to try to make an impact. But this new venture is designed to make an eternal impact. And if you'll stay with me, and the entire Unbeatable Army will come with me, together we'll continue to inspire and uplift people. We'll create change that will last in people's lives over a lifetime. And we'll try to do something that will shake the foundations of heaven, that will matter into eternity. I just want to tell you thanks. Thanks for being so loyal to the podcast, and thanks for your continued support. Now, stay tuned for more updates about this television show, about the television channel that I'm creating to replace the Unbeatable podcast, called Jeff Strucker Ministries. Can't wait for you to see it as we get ready to launch it in just a few weeks. See you guys. And now, my interview with Diane Sorensen.
These stories of triumph over adversity will help you handle your toughest days in life and become unbeatable.
Hey Diane, welcome to Unbeatable. Thanks for being my guest today.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here. So
I'm looking forward to this conversation because I think there's something that everybody who's listening can learn from. And I know a whole lot of ladies who probably need to be on the edge of their seat during this conversation with you. I'd like to know, so our podcast is about helping people overcome their challenges. Don't run from them. Don't quit in the middle of them. Overcome them.
yeah.
But in your case, Diane, you've got there's a part of your story that I think most people can resonate with. And I'd love for you to be able to tell us, how does somebody become unbeatable when they've inherited something in their family DNA that's part of who you are? And although you didn't want to pass this on to the next generation, you found yourself right in the middle of passing on, some issues from your family that you inherited, and now you're living those out in your generation and passing them on to the next. Like, how do you beat that generational cycle is really what I want people to hear from you during this interview.
Yeah. Well, it goes back to, how I was raised and eventually how I passed on certain patterns unknowingly. and then my wake up call. And so that's what we'll talk about today.
Yeah, sure. And I'm using this as a setup because there's some mom that's driving in a minivan and listening to this podcast right now, and she's saying, "Uh-oh, I think what Jeff and Diane are about to talk about is exactly where I come from." And some inherited patterns that you're saying, how do I get this out of my family's future? Is really what I want people to hear from you today.
Yeah. And, I think my story, I think you're right. I think will resonate with a lot of people because I'm just a normal person. And there wasn't something huge or big, completely, a tragedy or, abuse or anything I could point to in my childhood that was super traumatic. But I think what the pattern was, and I think what a lot of people are going to relate to is this invisible pattern. And
Yeah.
my journey really is about going from trying to be enough to being who I am.
Sounds amazing. Let's just get into it.
Okay.
Because we've had lots of people that have had these ultra traumatic experiences. They've been able to get over it. But I think personally, getting over something that's been passed down from generation to generation to generation in your family may be as difficult or more difficult because those super traumatic events, that's a moment in time, whereas generation after generation, I mean, that's all day long, every day, in some cases in your childhood, in adulthood, or even when you become a mom. So let's go back to early on and the way that you were raised and some of the issues that you inherited as a child.
Yeah. So I was raised in a very typical middle class family, went to church every Sunday. Um, you know, we were, pretty typical. From the outside looking in, we look like the all American family. Um, but um, what was happening that nobody really talks about was that, there's this cultural pressure on parents to have their children behave or, right? We're all told that we're to make our children behave. And if we don't, we're judged, right, as a bad parent. And so one of my mother's biggest fears, I can now look back and understand that her biggest fear was to not be seen as a good parent. And I think that's a lot of our fears, especially as mothers, to be seen, to not be seen as a good mother. And so the other side of that is being seen as a bad mother.
Yeah.
And that feels just really like, oh. So in the first place, and I'll start here. The first experience I had with not being able to be who I am was church. And was just my experience. Other people may have
Yeah,
experienced
sure.
church that, where they have a real sense of belonging. But what I experienced was that I needed to quiet and silent. And it was my mother's biggest fear for us to be called out or have the attention that, oh, her children are acting out. She was not a good mom. And so it started at a very young age, at home with church practice. And we would have to sit for an hour with the expectation of not talking or really
Fidgeting and
moving
all of that. Yeah, sure.
for an hour. And me and my sister especially, I have older siblings. I have a sister 3 years older than me. I was the youngest, and this started at, 2 to 3 years old. And when we didn't sit still and quiet, as most 3-year-olds don't do for
Yeah,
very
that's
long,
a slow form of torture for a 3-year-old right
right?
there.
Um, my mother would turn into what I refer to as the big dark shadow. And then she would yell and scream and grab and, do whatever she needed to do to keep us silent. And so I grew up with being terrified to use my voice. And so then on the contrast, and I will say this too, that how you learn to do one piece of life
Yeah,
is shows up in all areas of
sure,
life.
of course.
And so this practice really was life practice for me. And this is where I learned that the world will judge me and I need to be a certain way. It didn't matter who I was. What mattered was how people perceived me. And so I became very hyper vigilant on how people reading people's facial expressions, their body language, and who I needed to be to not be rejected, basically, not get into trouble, because that's primal, right? We need to be able to belong to, our tribe, our family, our group. And that is a primitive need. We can't survive without that. So this sense of being rejected is like that sends us into survival. And what do I need to do to survive this? I had to become who I thought I had to become. And it's really performative. I had to behave. Behave means perform in the way the adults around you want you to. And so I adapted this performance really of being very pleasing to others. I say my costume was I had the perfect hair, the perfect makeup, the perfect clothes, the perfect body, which was thin. And this is the way I went through life. And it got me a lot of validation, which
Sure, of course.
was
In our society, that would happen.
right, and that was addictive, to have this validation. So I did whatever I needed to do to be approved of, and it worked. I was getting a lot of approval until I had children.
Yeah. That will humble even the most perfect or the most well-performing adult.
Right, right, and so
Um, can I pause for just a second? I want to go back to the big dark shadow. There are some people listening right now that are thinking, "Oh, what kind of a church was it that put that kind of pressure on you to be perfect as a 3-year-old girl in church?" What I heard you say is it wasn't church that put that pressure on me. It was mom practicing church at home.
yes.
And if I didn't sit right in home, then my mother became the big dark shadow. I don't want people to get the impression that it was your church's fault. It sounds to me
No.
like it was mom that was doing
It
this,
was
not
mom.
church that
Church
was
just
doing it.
happened to be the first place that it showed up,
Okay.
in my memory out in the
Yeah.
world. And I told the big Dutch shadow, this is, it wasn't who my mother was, but the shadow side of her was her fear of not being good enough. And so she needed her children to be good enough. And so when I had children, I became their big dark shadow.
Big dark shadow. Really.
Unknowingly, unwittingly created the perfect family. From the outside looking in, we looked like the perfect family. My children were well behaved in public. It looked like we had it all. And it came at a very big price.
Yeah. I want to pause and just talk about in our society, people are judged by the way that they look and by the way that other people perceive you. I think the pressure on a mom is insane in our society. And basically, you're taking a final exam that's going to make or break your entire academic career every day as a mom when you go out in public, right? And it's the way that your children act that you're judged as a mom. When you're growing up, your mother has this fear that she's not going to be good enough based on the way that you act. And I'm just assuming that this is one of those things as a young woman, a teenage girl at home, you're saying, I'm never going to do this when I become a mom. And then you
Absolutely.
become a mom, and all of a sudden you do the very thing that you said, I'm never ever going to do when you
Right.
become a mom.
Right.
So, can you describe how is it that you fall into the very thing that you said I would that you grew up thinking I don't ever want to do this when I become a parent, and you fall into it too without even knowing that you're falling into it?
So what happens is you, like I said, this primal need to be accepted. So you as a child, I was reading people and we say, okay, is this how I need to be? Is this how I need to be? And trying to be whoever I was supposed to be in that
Yeah, what other people wanted you to
right.
be,
What
right?
other people wanted me to be pleasing, be accommodating, be convenient, um, for everybody else. And there was a sense of something's off. I just had, had this sense that I was never good enough no matter what I did. It never really got me the approval that I really sought from my mother, especially. Um, so the bar really kind of was always moving, for one thing. And you get lost in this. I mean, it's not a conscious thing that, okay, who do I need to be now? You just do it, right?
This sounds terrible if you're being judged based on your performance, but your performance is never good enough to get you the approval that you're looking for. So you try harder or you perform better in a different area, but still you're not measuring up. That right there sounds like, it sounds like an insane way of growing up, but this is the way most people function in a Western society, especially a country like ours in the United States.
Yeah. Yeah. And I knew I'm not gonna it didn't feel good growing up and I didn't want my children to feel that way. And so I just swore I was gonna do it different. But if you don't know what the pattern is that you need to do differently, you don't know how to do it differently. And I swore I wasn't going to yell at my children and they were just going to be happy. We were going to, everybody was just going to be happy. And when they used behavior that really touched that insecurity of not being good enough. This was a stress response. It was automatic. Boom. I
A dark shadow came out
became
of you, whether
their
you
dark
wanted it or
shadow.
not, right? Wow.
Right, right. And it's just an automatic. And we know, like, we can be like, oh, I don't know why I'm always yelling, or I don't know why I'm always doing this certain thing that doesn't feel good, but yet we keep doing it because we don't understand what the pattern actually is that needs to be shifted.
Right. You said that this came at a high cost. So you're a parent. Talk about your children when you start to learn about the high cost of this big dark shadow coming out of you.
Yeah, so I was a great performer. I mean, I started at an early age and I perfected this performance, and really unknowingly used, I don't know, actions, attitudes, behaviors that really said, I need my children to be a part of this performance. And like I said, we had perfect family status. People are like, oh, we've got it all together. Because again, if we look like we have it all together, we have it all together. Um, and the somebody from my daughter's school came to me, and I remember the words just piercing through me. And these were the words I heard: "Your daughter, she's cutting herself." And I just could not wrap my head around this. I didn't understand it. I couldn't see all of the signs because I was so wrapped up in trying to be good enough for everybody else that I didn't see those signs. But the truth of it was that I was actually doing the same thing on the inside for years, cutting myself down, judging myself, calling myself names in my head, starving myself to be thin enough, which it was never thin enough. And just proving, perfecting, pleasing to gain the approval of everybody out there. And then numbing it all with alcohol because it became too much. And that's where we landed. And when this happened with my daughter, this whole process, and I will be very honest with you, when it first came out, it wasn't like, "Oh my, I need to change some things." I
Yeah.
was pissed. And that can
Because
sound
she's ruining the picture perfect family, right?
right. That can sound really kind of crazy that she was going through something really heavy and I was mad about it because you are not fitting into the picture. And
Right.
why are you doing this to me? Which now I understand, oh, that's how my mother was seeing it too. Why are
Yeah.
you doing this to me? Just do all the right things and then everything will be fine. And I'll feel good enough. And this really woke me up to seeing the cultural patterns that not are just not in my family, but they're cultural patterns. They're expectations that are unrealistic and outdated that do not promote emotional or mental health. In fact, it's an erosion of that. So that's when I went on my own journey of detangling all of this and healing myself.
Well, this is why your interview today really is it touches everybody because you just described it a moment ago as a cultural issue, not just a generational thing, not just something that you inherited in your family.
Well,
But there's moms out there that are listening to you that are saying, I feel exactly like you do, and I inherited the same kind of thing that you inherited from my mother. There's guys out there though that are hearing you have to perform and you have to be good enough. And if you don't work 60 or 70 hours a week and bring home this much money, then you're not good enough because that's what their father did and that's what their father before them did. And you're right, in our society, it is about what you do and not about who you are that people judge you for. And if you want to fit in, you're going to get judged. I could not help but think the Olympics is going on and it's right in its zenith when this episode airs. And it being a mom was an Olympic event. The judges would not necessarily look at how well dressed your daughter is, how well behaved your daughter is, how clearly she can answer questions and stuff like that. There's something much more profound, much more important as a parent than just having a child that looks the part. So, hearing, hey, your daughter has a mental health problem and she's cutting herself. She's physically in her skin showing the pain that's already happening inside her heart. That right there is one of those things that's going to crush you when you're, trying to win the gold medal in the mom event, in this broken contest that we call parenting in our culture. So I'm just trying to, give people out there that are listening a little context to how devastating that news would be when when it finally sinks in. She's not doing this to me. She's doing this to herself because of something that I'm doing to me
Right,
and
right.
doing to
And
her
so
also.
what's happening was this pain of not being good enough could not be pushed down and hidden anymore. She was making it seen. She couldn't contain this pain anymore. She became, the uh, picture of my own pain, my mother's pain, her mother's pain, all the mother's pain. And how we need to do this differently. We don't need to be good enough. We need to be who we are. And when we do that, we actually set our children free
Uh-huh.
to become who they are meant to be or who they want to be.
That's when you start to become the gold mother mom that you're supposed to be.
Yeah.
Um, but before we get into your journey to figure this out and to fix this so that it doesn't destroy your family and actually you as well, there's a point where you have to decide, if I'm going to get serious about this, I'm going to have to get very real, very transparent, very vulnerable. And what people have already heard from you over and over in this interview is, I'm going to have to let people see some of the dark, ugly stuff inside of me
Right. My
if I'm really going to get
imperfectness.
healthy.
Who wants
Yeah.
that?
That right there is where few people will ever have the courage. That defines somebody that's unbeatable, who says, I'm going to have to get really public about how ugly and how dysfunctional things are inside of me in order for me to start to get healthy and beautiful inside and out. So I just would, if you can even put into words, finding the courage to say, if I'm going to do this, I have to get real and raw and vulnerable. That alone impresses me about your story. So, can you describe what that moment was like for you before you actually started this journey to get help?
Yeah. And, to be really honest, I I think it was a process. It was a peeling away.
Mhm.
I will tell you about a moment. Um, but at that same time, my marriage also fell apart. So not only is my daughter
So,
going,
it's out there for everybody now, right?
it
Yeah,
is out
everybody can
there
see
for
it.
everybody. It's like, okay, we're not containing this anymore. And now it's out there for everybody. But there was a moment that part of me was relieved. It was like, people were very compassionate. One thing they were like, "You? Are you kidding me? What the heck?" Well, I performed well. Which I didn't know I was performing. I was just surviving. It wasn't a conscious thing. But when this all happened, um, it was almost a relief, like, I don't have to pretend anymore. And I didn't realize how exhausted I was
Wow.
keeping
That's a great word.
all of this up.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. And so there did come a point where I was like, okay, things aren't going well with my children. My marriage is falling apart. My relationship with my mother is also not so great. And really the yeah, what do you say? The factor, the what do I want to say here? That um I was the one denominator, the common
Yeah. You're
denominator.
the common
The common
denominator in this
denominator
equation.
was me. There was a while I thought my children just needed to behave, my husband needed to just do it my way, and my mother just needed to quit judging me. And then I there was a moment in time one day when I was at school, I was a teacher, and I was sitting at my desk, and I had this thought, maybe this has something to do with me. Maybe this has something to do with the
Wow.
way I was raised. Huh. And I don't know what this means, but I need to figure this out.
Yeah.
And it was just a moment. It was just a thought. And then I went about my day. But I really believe when you put it out there, the universe responds, and suddenly books were falling off the shelf, things were coming into my life to go, "Oh, there is another way." And that's when I started to learn different skills and really started to understand myself. Why was why did I behave in certain ways? And so I started to understand my own behavior, which then helped me to understand my children. Um, and started I started doing the work little by little by little. And I call it the inner work, which means we really have to look at our own truth, which is the hardest point, and which is why things had to crumble around me to get me to that point. Um, you know, Oftentimes we have to go through what I call a bathroom floor moment where, we are just brought to our knees before we can see that, okay, there's nowhere else to go. I need to look here.
Yeah. We've had some ladies on the show in the past who have dealt with eating disorders, and it's fascinating. Many of them will say, everything around me was going out of, going into chaos. And the only thing that I could control was how I looked. And so I would control the way people spoke to me, the way that they responded to me based on how I looked. And I did that through some extreme eating disorders. And they talk about the challenge of getting over that because really what you're doing is giving up the fantasy of control, right? I didn't really have control over other people's impressions of me, but I thought I did by the way that I looked, by the way what I'm hearing from you today, the way that I acted, the way that people complimented me. And I thought I had control over all those things. But then there's the moment where it all crashes in around you and you realize, you know what? I really didn't have control the whole time. I just fooled myself into thinking that I had control. So when you finally realize, you know what, there is a common denominator behind my mother, my marriage, and my children, and it's me, I got some work to do on me. Now starts the journey of trying to break a generational cycle. So what do you do next?
Yeah. Well, I went to therapy. I hired coaches and
Good
mentors
for you.
and,
Yeah.
went to the conferences and, I learned um, just new ways. And the first way really came through my teaching profession, where I went to an early childhood conference and I was always pulled toward behavior. I always wanted to understand it. Um, and went to early childhood conference and conscious discipline was there. And I thought, I wonder what that's about. And I went to this conference or this breakout session, and I knew in my soul, I knew that I'm not sure what this is, but I want more of this. And then that took me on a whole journey of bringing it into our school system. I ended up eventually teaching it in my classroom and then teaching it to the entire system, and then eventually leaving and doing my own with coaching. So that's kind of a really short a short way to put
Yeah.
my journey.
I want to talk more about the coaching that you're doing in just a few minutes, but I hope that people that are listening didn't miss the fact that you were a teacher. If I understand correctly, you had studied early childhood education while this is going on inside of you, while this is happening with your children. And in other words, like I'm the one person on the planet that should have all of this figured out, not just by my actions and the way that I conduct myself in public, but by my training and education, I'm supposed to have it all figured out. And then the moment that you hear your daughter is cutting herself, there's something really wrong. That's the moment that you have no choice but to admit, maybe I don't have everything figured out. Maybe I'm not the expert that everybody assumes that I
Right.
am.
So I have two whammies. I'm supposed to be a good mother just because I have children, and then I'm supposed to know how to do it because I'm a teacher. I have an
Yeah.
education background. But here's the thing, that education didn't teach me about emotional wellness. And that's really what I bring to my coaching, is what I'm really doing is teaching emotional wellness, because I think that is the piece that our traditional culture, in a lot of instances, has missed.
Yeah. Now we're getting to the part of this episode that everybody can lean in and listen to because everybody, to some degree or another, has dealt with some emotionally unhealthy situations in their childhood. Some of them have lived there, like you have. And there's a lot of them that have said, I will never, ever, I saw my dad abuse my mom. I will never, ever be a husband who will abuse my wife, and then turns around and abuses their wife. Or I saw my mother do this in public and I'll never do that. And then they turn right around and do it just because they've been conditioned that way.
Or here's
So you,
here's another thing, if I can
sure.
interject here. The other thing I see too a lot of times with mothers is that then the pendulum swings all the way to the other side. So I had really strict mother. I'm not going to do that. Now I'm all the way on the other side where now I'm permissive because I'm so afraid of that strictness. And that is not any better than the strictness, really, because it's very confusing to children on how does this work.
Yeah. When you say, I won't be that strict, let the children go out there and juggle knives if they want to. That's
Yeah, and not,
obviously not the most healthy
yeah, and
situation for
so
a
it
child to.
gets to the point where it's like, I don't know how to do this. What is the right way?
I literally don't know one parent who, after having their first child, hasn't looked at somebody and honestly said, I have no idea what I'm doing or how to do this,
Right.
and kind of felt like I stumbled. My wife and I have 5 children. They're all grown now, but there really wasn't a day where I didn't feel like I was stumbling my way through it and never had it figured out, and just trying to, trying to figure out the next 5 minutes, let alone, the future of being a parent.
Yeah. And before I became a mom, I thought I was going to be such a great mom because I love children. I've always wanted to be a mom. And yeah, it didn't go the way I thought it was going to because I didn't know about all of this stuff on the inside that I hadn't addressed.
Yeah. So now you start addressing them, and eventually you start training it in the school, and now you start coaching and teaching people this. Let's get into, how do you help people who are stuck right where you used to be and who are saying, I got some stuff that I need to work on and I don't even know where to start.
Yeah. Yeah. So the coaching that I do is uh, designed to help people return to the essence of who they are, really their truth, by by dissolving the blocks and barriers that keep them stuck. They discover how powerful they actually are in creating lasting change. Because the truth is, we are all capable of creating what we're really committed to. But here's the thing, most of us don't realize what we are most committed to. And a lot of times we are most committed to those avoidance strategies or those coping skills that we learn in childhood to cope with our surroundings, our environment. For me, that was perfecting the way I showed up in the world, the way I looked, um, the way I pleased people, because if I didn't please them, they wouldn't like me. But in order to do that, I had to give up what my own self. I had to abandon, it's a kind of a separation of separating our mind and our heart, and then we live in our head. and figure out how, to survive. So this is really coming back home to ourselves and discovering what is actually true for us. Because if you ask a woman, what do you want? That is like, I don't know. We don't even know what we want because, too, I think we've learned not to want because, that's selfish. Don't want, just help everybody else. Um, and so we just kind of disconnect from wanting and we get our needs met by how much we can do for others, how much we can achieve, how much we can produce.
Okay, what you're describing sounds like something all of us can work on. But this appears to me to be far more difficult in reality than just simply what the words say. Because if you grew up in a performance related environment, which is where most people grew up, then all of your validation or any of the criticism came from what you do. And you already described it as this is primal, right? We need our tribe there. We need to have people in our lives that affirm you and that come alongside you. And if the way that you got that affirmation or the way that you developed strong relationships is by performing, what I'm hearing you say now is you had to basically shift. And if I'm hearing you correctly, this is an entirely different shift. No longer seeing yourself by your performance, no longer allowing people to judge you by performance, but now becoming who true to who you really are. And I want to point out the words were not lost on me. This is no longer about what you do. This is about who you are, which is a world of difference
Yes.
in the way that you
Yes.
relate to other people. And I am certain there are people right now that are saying, hold on just a second. How do you go from no longer functioning in public by what you do and now starting to function and conduct yourself by who you are? How do you even make that shift?
Right. It's
Because it seems like a radical shift.
it's a process. It's a process. And I think culturally we don't like process. We want a
No,
strategy.
we want it to done,
We
and we
right,
want it
yeah.
done in
Give me
three
the
easy steps.
strategy and
Give me three easy
check,
steps.
check, check the checklist. It's a one and done. Now I'm good. Um, and that's not what it is. It's really committing to a lifetime to this journey of becoming who you are. And it's always evolving. And so, like I said, I early on learned it didn't matter who I was, it mattered how people saw me. And now, as an adult, happens is we internalize this, and now it's not other people doing it to us, it's us doing it to ourselves. And we're actually judging ourselves. So, other people may or may not be judging us, but they're stuck in their own fear of me judging them. So, yeah. And so it's really it's doing brave work. It is really courageous work um, to, yeah, own your truth. And one of the things that really shifted things for me was taking ownership of my own story, the things I tell myself in my head, whether they're true or not, really owning how I feel and my own actions, taking ownership of it. Because when you take ownership of it, it liberates you. You no longer have to hide it and pretend it's not there or pretend that, you know, shove it under the rug and say everything's fine over here. Nothing to look at here. So when you own it, there's nothing for people to talk about, right? You're just going,
Right?
yep, that's how it happened.
Yeah. There's a guy right now who's listening who's working himself literally to death, trying to make enough money so that he can afford a nice car and a corner office and nice clothes and a big fat bank account so that people will think highly of them. There's some teenager that is working themselves to death in school just so that they can be the valedictorian and have a GPA so that everybody will think highly of themselves. There's moms, there's young women out there that are working themselves to death, trying to look a certain way in public so that people will affirm them and think highly of them. And what we're describing right now throws all of that into chaos. And every one of them are saying, I would love to make this transition, but I don't know. And I'm just going to use the word you used a moment ago. I don't know if I have the courage to be willing to step back and to say, I'm no longer going to allow others to judge me based on how fast I run or how pretty I am or how smart I am or how much money is in the bank account. That takes a lot of courage. That may take more courage than staring down an enemy rifle on a
Yeah.
battlefield because it's day in and day out courage.
Yeah, and it doesn't happen all at once. I mean, a lot of people, and I too was like, "What? So I'm not supposed to care what other people think?" So
So I'm just gonna walk out of the house with with all messed up, looking all messed up and acting all messed up.
right. So it it's not about not caring about what other people think, because we do care. We do. What it is about learning to consider what I think before considering what other people think. Learning to consider how I feel as much or before what other people are feeling. Because here's one of the big things is we are so afraid of upsetting other people. We are so afraid of conflict that our avoidance of it is creating chaos in our lives. And so there's it's like this unspoken agreement in our culture that I won't upset you, you don't upset me. I'm going to perform. I'm just going to use that word because that's the word we've been using. I'm going to perform or behave in ways so that you don't get upset. But the other side of that coin is now I also expect you to act in ways so I don't get upset. And nobody's taking responsibility for their own upset, for their own
Uh-huh.
feelings, for their own behavior. It's you act this way, so I'm okay, and I'll act this way, so you're okay. And that's not
Yeah.
relationships. That's actually an arrangement.
Yeah, it's a transaction, right? Or a
Right.
contract is it's an unwritten contract.
Right. Right. And so when I learned to take ownership of how I felt, and actually, it even, I had to learn to feel. I had to learn what that even was. I don't know really what I thought feeling was, but here's what I know is what I learned was I had two feelings. They were happy and mad, and I didn't feel them. I acted them out. So if I was happy, everybody knew I was happy. And if I was mad, everyone knew I was mad. And so that was the only way I knew how to communicate how I felt because that wasn't okay to feel growing up. Don't be mad, don't be sad, don't don't what I learned was harmony at all costs. Don't make anybody upset ever. Don't say or act or do anything ever to upset anybody.
Which is impossible to do for
Right.
5 minutes
So
in a
it
human
creates this
society.
perfection. And so what I say is my journey is going from perfection to connection. And that has been a process. And that's what I teach now because it's what I most needed to learn was how to connect. And so I had to learn how to connect with my own feelings inside, which our feelings are a deep, intimate part of ourself. And so learning how to feel those, the first time somebody said, "What do you feel?" I feel angry. Where do you feel it? I'm like, "What do you mean?" "Well, where in your body?" I'm like, "My body? What are you talking about?" And I don't know. I guess I thought emotions were out there somewhere. They were, people were making me have them.
Yeah,
They either made me happy or they made me mad, and they were going to pay the price.
right.
Um, So, that's a huge part of the process, understanding our emotions and having a relationship with our emotions.
I'm sure people are dying to know the answer to this. How did things change between you and your children, especially your 17-year-old daughter, when you started down this journey?
Yeah. Um, so again, that was a process. They are growing up now. That was almost 20 years ago. And we do have a great relationship now. And I will tell you that part of this whole journey, because they were older teens into being young adults
Yeah,
when I
yeah,
came into this. And so, this wasn't unfolding in a process, but I started seeing them parent in the same way I was parenting, which horrified
really,
me. So,
yeah,
at first it was like, oh no, this isn't the way to do it. And, I
uh,
was, one of those mothers who was now the judger.
yeah,
This is the
yeah,
way you should do it with your children until I really learned to let go, really learn to
yeah,
let go of who they needed to be and now who my grandchildren needed to be so I wouldn't have shame, so that I would feel okay. And so when I was able to really release that and really go to another level of focusing on me and how I wanted to feel and how I showed up, they started their own journeys. They saw what I was doing and started their own journeys. And we can openly talk now about all the stuff that happened. And I'll share too that this 17-year-old daughter not so many years ago wrote me a letter, um explain, just because she was doing her own work, and she this was part of her um, coming to terms with her own emotions and her own inner stuff. And she said, this isn't to blame anybody. This is just to communicate how I felt. So I had the opportunity to see her growing up years from her perspective,
yeah.
which was
Wow.
both fascinating and heartbreaking
Yeah, I
at
bet
the
it
same
was.
time. But if I had not gone on this journey, I would have not been able to hear any of it.
Hmm.
And alls I said to her was, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. This was your experience.
Yeah,
Period. There was no trying to justify it. There was no
right.
saying, "I didn't know." There was none of that. It was, "I'm so sorry. This was your experience." Period.
Yeah.
And that was so validating to her.
Hmm.
And yeah, so we're all on our own journeys. And there used to be a time where people would say, "How are your kids doing?" And in my mind, I'd think, I'd say good, but in my mind, I'd be like, "I'm really not sure if they're good, but they say they're good." There
Yeah,
was a
yeah,
time where they would tell me if they weren't good, and now they do. Now they come to me and they're like, "This is happening. What do you think?" Or,
yeah.
so that I can just support them. So it's really beautiful. And that's the reason I call my programs beautiful behavior. Because one, the behavior that was happening was actually a catalyst for my growth. So, and it's also become this beautiful journey. Even though parts of it are very difficult, um, it's really beautiful when you own it and move through it.
Right. Well, it sounds like that big dark shadow childhood that you inherited, you're now trying to change into something beautiful that you can pass on and your children can pass on
Yeah.
to their children. Really, it does. And I started the interview with this. It sounds like you're figuring out, and it's a 20-year process or a 20-year journey to get there, but you're figuring out how to change and break something that's you've inherited generation after generation. And if you can do that, anybody can break those generational issues that they're struggling with.
Yes, yes.
You called it beautiful behavior. There are people that are listening right now that are saying, okay, I need what you're describing and I don't know how to get it. I don't even know where to start. So Diane, what would you tell them if they wanted to know more about beautiful behavior or wanted to connect with you and say, if they're thinking to themselves, I need some help. Maybe Diane is somebody who can help me go through the process that she's gone through.
Yeah. So one is they can tune into the podcast to learn a little bit more. So the podcast is called Beautiful Behavior.
And we'll put links to all of this in the notes when we
Okay.
wrap up.
And they can also go to my website to learn a little bit more and to schedule a call. And then we can um, get together, learn a little bit more about each other, and then we create the program that will take them from wherever it is they are to wherever it is they want to go.
Yeah. Well, Diane, before we started talking, I was thinking to myself, this interview is going to be very different than what I've typically done in the past. I've talked to those people that have gone through those super traumatic moments and asked them how they got through it without quitting, without, letting those moments defeat them. But as I said already a couple of times in this interview, I really think that what you've done takes more courage because those super traumatic moments are just an event in time. What you are dealing with is something that I've inherited. I've lived it, I passed it on, and now figuring out how do I break this so that it doesn't continue for many generations after me. And I got to tell you, you really are an unbeatable woman, Diane Sorensen.
Thank you so much. Thank you. This was,
Yeah, thanks for agreeing to be a guest on this episode with me.
you're welcome.
Hey, if you're sitting there listening to this episode and you're thinking to yourself, man, this lady is describing right where I am. And not just where I am, but she's describing where I was when I grew up. And she's describing what you're passing on to the next generation. If you're sitting there saying, man, I need more information, well, go check out Diane Sorensen's website. The link is right there in the notes to this episode, or go check out her podcast, Beautiful Behavior. We put the link to that one in the notes to this episode. But really, what I hope that you will go away with from this episode is thinking, you know what? I am going to think about how I feel and how I view myself first before I start thinking about how others view me or how others feel about me. I hope Diane has given you the courage to start to make that day in and day out, all day long change. Thanks for sticking with me on this episode of the podcast. And I hope that you've enjoyed what you've heard. I hope that you have been encouraged week after week by these episodes. We try to put motivational content out there all week long. We do it on the Unbeatable Podcast social media platforms. And if you're not already part of those social media platforms, why don't you just search for us? We're on almost all of them. And you can find us by just searching at Unbeatable or at Unbeatable Podcast. You're also going to find our fan of the week this week. Tom Spooner, you are awesome. And you're so awesome that we declare you to be the fan of the week this week. So Tom, thank you for being connected. For everybody out there, thank you for being connected with us on social media. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Unbeatable Podcast. I can't wait to roll out the big changes that are coming real soon. See you next week. God bless.
These stories of triumph over adversity will help you handle your toughest days in life and become unbeatable.